We are rolling. Hey, Julia.
Hi, how's it going?
Good. So this is Mark Goldberg with UN Dispatch, UN Affairs blog, speaking with Julia Spiegel from the Enough Project. Or is it the Enough Campaign? I always seem to get that confused.
It's the Enough Project.
The Enough Project.
Mm-hmm.
Julia, as I think regular viewers will know, is a sort of, I guess you count as a regular guest on UN Plaza. This is, I think, your third appearance. Most of the time these days you are in Kampala, Uganda. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's home base, but I travel a lot around the region.
You travel. Yeah, and we actually tried to do this while you were in Uganda, but the internet gods were not cooperating. But luckily for me, you're sort of in a rare trip back to the States, where I'm speaking to you from an undisclosed location in California, I believe.
Correct.
So we're going to be talking about sort of the ongoing crisis in northern Uganda. Julia, you're one of sort of the sharpest analysts of this region and of this crisis, and I'm really happy to have you on again, particularly as there have been significant developments recently. Mm-hmm. Last month, there was this unprecedented joint military action against the Lord's Resistance Army, which is the rebel group in the region. The military action was a sort of coordinated between the military forces of the Ugandan army, the Congolese army, and the Southern Sudanese army. And this action was aimed at a LRA camp somewhere in Congolese territory. So maybe I'll sort of turn it over to you to sort of describe what happened there.
Sure. I mean, do you want a little bit of backstory on the LRA first, or dive right into the military operation?
Well, why don't you explain what happened here, and then we'll sort of fill in details about the LRA and what happened and why it happened.
Sure. Basically, after ongoing peace negotiations that had lasted since July 2006 and had borne no fruit whatsoever, it was very clear that Kony, the self-proclaimed Messianic leader of the Lord's Resistance Army, was not interested in signing a peace deal. There were 7 failed attempts to get this deal signed. And so the regional governments and their respective armies came together and launched this offensive against the hideouts that the LRA had established in eastern Congo in a park known as Garamba National Park. Now, this park is a massive thicket with very difficult terrain, almost no people settled there, and is very isolated from any sort of governance presence. So the LRA had staked out the area for itself and had established what are actually, now that we know, since the forces have moved in, well-established safe havens. They had massive fields of crops. They had generators for electricity. Joseph Kony himself had nice bedding, and they were living the good life in the Congo, where they had a very safe area to reestablish their military strength. So basically, after these failed attempts, coupled by the fact that over the last year, Joseph Kony and the LRA had actively been rebuilding their military strength, roughly around 400 children had been abducted and were being trained to be used as child soldiers in the LRA ranks over this time period when ongoing peace negotiations were taking place. Yet another indicator that Joseph Kony was not interested in giving up the fight. So finally, after frustration with failed peace efforts, after acknowledging that Joseph Kony was building in strength and could become a larger threat in the future, the regional armies decided to come together and launch an offensive. Now, the Enough Project, and myself in particular, we had been calling for a surgical military strike for quite some time, a strike going in focus just at apprehending the LRA leadership. What we've seen was much more of a blanket bombing approach with sort of a sloppy cleanup. So they went in with jet fighters and helicopter gunships and bombed the 5 main camps, particularly Kony's main camp. Somehow Kony received warning beforehand about this attack and so was not present in the camp. And there were very limited casualties, and it took over 3 days before ground forces were able to go in and sweep up, and by then the bodies were gone, the rebels were gone. So what we're seeing is a messy, lengthy aftermath.
So Kony escaped. You presume unharmed. Has there been any sort of word from him, or have there been any communications between Kony and any international negotiators since this attack?
Yeah, well, Joseph Kony is very clever. I mean, the main way that the Ugandan government and other regional intelligence collecting agencies were able to assess where these hideouts were was through using satellite Thuraya telephone communication and triangulating their positions. So what Kony has done is that he uses lower-level commanders to get back on the airwaves and get in touch with the dispersed LRA elements. So we know that he's back in touch with his troops. We've seen a spate of attacks by the LRA in the region since this offensive was launched on December 14th. So we do know he's alive, we do know he's communicating with his troops, but he avoids going on the Thuraya satellite phone himself because he knows that will make it easier to target him.
Mm-hmm. So here's a question. It makes sense that the sort of Ugandan military forces would target him because, he's launched a pretty brutal campaign against the civilians of northern Uganda for 20 years. Like, as you said, using child soldiers as his modus operandi. It also makes sense that Congolese armed forces would go after him because, after all, as you said, he was hiding out on Congolese territory. But why Southern Sudan? They're not even a sort of internationally recognized government. Why would they go after him?
Well, the Southern Sudanese, in some respect, have a more compelling reason to want to do something about it than both Uganda and Congo at this point. Uganda in particular, because the LRA haven't been present in the north for a couple of years now. For Southern Sudan, the LRA, especially starting in 2006, when the Southern Sudanese government decided to mediate these peace talks, the reason why they decided to do that is because the LRA posed a strategic threat to their very existence. Historically, the government of Khartoum, the ruling party in northern Sudan, has worked with the LRA, arming them, training them, and used them to destabilize southern Sudan when they were engaged in a lengthy and brutal civil war in their country. So, as long as the LRA still exists, they pose a very serious threat to the Southern Sudanese, particularly as tensions rise with the comprehensive peace agreement signed between Northern and Southern Sudan in 2005. And so the fear is that the LRA could be used again by Khartoum to destabilize the South. In addition to that, ongoing attacks have been taking place in Western Equatoria and Southern Sudan, and even Central Equatoria for many years now. So even while things were relatively stable and peaceful in Northern Uganda, civilians were paying the price in Southern Sudan. So they have a very strong strategic and human imperative for doing something now.
Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, so you said that the strikes against the Kony's camps in Congo were a response to the fact that he has been intransigent in the peace process. I'm wondering if you could explain what the source of his reluctance to enter into a peace agreement might be.
Mm-hmm. Well, the fact is, if you went around and you asked the chief mediators of these talks, if you asked the Ugandan government delegation, if you asked the UN special envoy for LRA-affected areas, why do you think Kony wants to sign a peace deal? They would say, well, it's been 22 years. We think, he must be tired. He's getting old. Life in the bush is hard. But the fact is, based on his actions, he doesn't seem tired. He doesn't seem frustrated. He doesn't seem like he wants to end this. And the problem all along was the fact that you had ongoing negotiations with all sorts of persuasions, carrots, things to sweeten the deal, and no sticks. There was absolutely no pressure put on the table, aside from the unenforced International Criminal Court indictments against him and there are only two remaining other LRA leaders with indictments over their heads still. Aside from that, there were no sticks, no reasons to compel him to make any concessions. So, in the meantime, he had peace negotiations that were providing him with shipments of food, with deliveries of medicine. He had time to actively rebuild his force. He was gaining all sorts of benefits from the process, and there were no repercussions for him.
Mm-hmm. Well, now it seems that bombs are starting to drop, so there are repercussions. Mm-hmm. Now, I've seen reports, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that since this offensive against the LRA in Congo, the LRA itself has stepped up its own offensive and is sort of restarting a pretty aggressive campaign to kidnap and conscript children in East Congo. Mm-hmm. Am I correct in reading those reports?
Yeah, that is correct. I mean, information is always murky in these areas and difficult to confirm just because of the lack of people on the ground and active international actors really engaged in the area. But yes, that is true. What essentially happened is we've opened Pandora's box. The Ugandan government, which was leading this effort, although working in conjunction with the Congolese army and the Southern Sudanese army, what they were hoping for was that their initial bombing campaign would nail the key leaders and this would be a quick and clean operation. That didn't happen, and now, as I said, Pandora's box has been opened, and it's a very messy aftermath, because what they've essentially done is unleashed an angry, hungry, and violent LRA. and they don't have sufficient ground forces to protect civilians in the area. I mean, it is a massive amount of territory just trying to seal the borders between countries. And so, naturally, if you're pushing this rebel group away from their jungle hideout where they had food, where they had shelter, where they had supplies, the only way that they're going to get it is by pillaging and taking at will. And so we're seeing this uptick as they try and reassemble and regroup.
So, do you still advocate sort of a military response? Do you think? I mean, it seemed that you advocated a military response. It didn't go quite as you had expected. Is the Enough Project? Are you still? Do you still consider this to be the way forward? That sort of military solution is viable?
Yeah. Well, listen. I think military action was long overdue given the circumstances. Now, what we got was a somewhat ill-conceived, ill-executed operation. So that is not ideal, but we're not in a worst-case scenario at this point. There are ways to try and make this operation more effective going forward. So I think what needs to happen is that we have to try and minimize the risk to civilians and maximize the likelihood of success. As far as success is concerned, we really need to focus the operation on just apprehending those key LRA leaders indicted by the International Criminal Court. Without those leaders, without Joseph Kony, Dominique Ongwen, and others, this thing's dead. I mean, it's in some instances of rebel groups, there are many leaders that you think could really keep the fight going. In this instance, this is a top-down rebel group, and there are many people who don't want to be fighting, but they were abducted into these ranks and forced to stay there and forced to fight. So once you get the LRA and the other leaders, they're done. Another way I think that the operation could improve moving forward is by really increasing the intelligence capabilities. Now, this isn't just a matter of gathering intelligence and saying, okay, we know these conversations were held here and so on, but really having coordinated, actionable intelligence and a ready, rapid response mechanism. Again, with the hope being that they can then act more effectively and quickly to go after those key LRA leaders. Mm-hmm.
Is there a sense that you're asking what are less than not the most developed and sophisticated armed forces in the world? I think it's fair to call the armed forces of the Southern Sudanese, Ugandan, and Congolese are not they're not as sophisticated a military as say Western militaries. Are you worried that you're asking them to take on a mission that they're not maybe capable of doing, of this kind of sophisticated intelligence analysis and these sort of surgical strikes that you speak of?
Mm-hmm. I mean, frankly, they shouldn't be doing it alone, and they aren't entirely doing it alone, but there is minimal international support. Now, that doesn't mean that Western troops need to be involved. You have to send in special forces from elsewhere to be really actively fighting this out on the ground, but it means that, some sort of fusion cell, coordination cell with key actors such as the U.S. and the U.K. who have very good intelligence capabilities, and that type of coordinating infrastructure could be more heavily involved and could work with that. But, as you said in your introduction, this is an unprecedented demonstration of regional cooperation to deal with a mutual security threat. And that is a step in the right direction. But as you said, some of these countries have sort of nascent, ill-equipped, ill-trained armies, and so to ensure the effectiveness of it, I think they need a bit more support, be it behind the scenes or whatever they're choosing.
So I guess, can you maybe set the scene right now? So the Kony camps have been bombed. He's rearming and regrouping. How large of a force are we talking about?
Again, it's difficult to pin down an exact number. Most military and intelligence officials estimate that it's between 600 and 1,000 combatants, plus around 200 women and children who are forced to stay with them. But now what's much more difficult to determine is how they're grouping and their numbers, because they have dispersed, which is their general strategy whenever any sort of offensive is launched, because then it's much harder to follow up.
That's
still,
shocking.
even
the numbers seem... Sorry, go ahead.
No, but I think this is what you were going to hit on. I mean, even if those are... I mean, you think 600, 1,000, that's not a large number of combatants, right? How much harm can they do, and why can't we solve this? But the fact is, the LRA are brutal fighters. I mean, many of these combatants were abducted when they're 9, 10, 11 years old. Fighting and killing and living in the bush is all they've ever known. And they are gruesome, and they are cruel and violent, and they know how to survive. They've been doing this for 22 plus years. On top of that, you have terrain that is incredibly difficult. I mean, just the area where the army base is set up in Dungu, where they're trying to launch many of these operations, the elephant grass is taller than, a fully grown man. You have huge rivers. You have a forest cover so thick that aerial reconnaissance can't see through. I mean, logistically, it actually is very challenging. And then you have this corner area between countries, right? So you have Central African Republic, you have Eastern Congo, you have Southern Sudan, and Uganda. And Central African Republic is the real wild card.
How so?
Well, the fact that there isn't much, it's a security vacuum. There's no one there. The LRA has already tracked a route to go there, and it has stockpiles of weapons and food waiting for them there. So the key question right now is, where is Kony? And no one really knows, and if he's made it to Central African Republic, that will make this job a hell of a lot more difficult, because there's no force to speak of to deal with him there, and it's not clear what the other regional governments who are already involved now will be able to do.
Yeah, it would seem that it would be something of a I don't know if it's unprecedented, but it would be a lot more difficult to launch this kind of joint military operation if you don't have the consent of the host territory, like you had in the situation like you had last month in Congo.
And in addition to that, if you don't know the terrain, if you're not familiar with the groups in the area, I mean, it's uncharted territory. And so once again, the LRA will have a very strong strategic advantage.
And essentially what you're describing is like a roving band of 600 to 1,000 marauders who seem to get by just on pillaging, raping, looting, and sort of intimidating local populations to support them or face death or mutilation.
I mean, usually when they enter a village, the first thing they do is collect the local leaders and local chiefs, kill them, set the whole place on fire, take what they want, abduct the children, and rape and murder the men and women. And that's how they survive.
And so maybe we can go back to how this, maybe we could give some sort of deeper historical context to how this conflict arose, how this group emerged. It started as a civil war, as you said, in northern Uganda in the late 1980s. Is that right?
Yeah, well, basically, after a lengthy and somewhat violent bush war, now President Yoweri Museveni took power of Uganda. Around the same time, a series of uprisings began in the economically and socially marginalized north. And the most notorious and enduring of those groups is the Lord's Resistance Army, which, as I said before, is led by self-proclaimed Messiah Joseph Kony. This group has become notorious for its use of child soldiers over these 22 years. It's estimated that they've abducted between 40,000 and 60,000 children who are used as child soldiers, sex slaves, and porters. They also targeted attacks on their own home areas where they would mutilate people that they thought were informing the government. They would burn and pillage and, again, abduct children to be used in their rebel ranks. So they actually terrorized their own home communities. But since the peace talks began in July 2006, there haven't been any attacks in northern Uganda. But what's so sad and so tragic is that while people began to become aware of what was happening in the north and now realize that it's relatively more stable and peaceful, these same attacks, these same atrocities, these same predations are taking place in eastern Congo and southern Sudan and Central African Republic, but there's no one there and there's no one watching and there's no one listening. So, as I said, that's part of the reason why Enough and I advocated that a surgical military operation was needed at this point. Unfortunately, that's not what we've gotten, but there are ways moving ahead that we can try and refocus the mission.
And I mean, so what in your ideal sort of scenario in the next sort of 6 months, how would such a military operation be coordinated? What would the United States have a role? Would sort of the United Nations have a role? What sort of is your ideal sort of situation going forward?
Well, as I said before, I think it's the actionable intelligence and rapid response capabilities that are needed right now to make it a more focused, targeted, quick response to this rebel threat that is now. I mean, it's much more difficult now that they're dispersed and spread, and Kony clearly is not on the airwaves like he was before because he realizes that makes him a ready moving target. So what we need is that type of intelligence and active engagement. So, as I said before, I think the U.S. and the U.K. have very good assets in the area and could become more involved on the ground just in the coordination sense. But again, you have to also avoid mission creep. I mean, the UPDF, the Ugandan army, got into some trouble in Congo in the early 2002 area, getting involved in mineral exploitation there. So there are real fears that if they stay in Congo for too long, will there be mission creep? Will they get involved in other business? It's very sensitive between countries, and that's part of the reason why this is such a shocking, unprecedented development, and welcome in that regard. But you have to be careful that these things don't start going awry as they did previously.
Mm-hmm. And I guess looking at you spend over the last year, you've spent a lot of time in northern Uganda itself. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, can you describe? So a tenuous peace is holding, and so I guess they're in the process of trying to rebuild societies after a 20-year civil war. What's that process like? Can you describe that at all?
Yeah, it's slow and messy and hard and unorganized, which I think is natural in most of these murky situations where it may be post-conflict, maybe not, and people don't know how stable or secure this relative peace is. At the height of the conflict a few years ago, there were nearly 2 million people living in internally displaced camps in the north. Now there are around 1 million, so about half have returned home. But conditions are still dire, and it's still very difficult for people to know whether or not they really can hang on to whatever it is that they've built, right? Because even if just 30 LRA rebels re-entered northern Uganda and there were a few small-scale attacks, everyone would rush back to those camps. Because they're terrified, and psychologically, they're still at war, and psychologically, they're still traumatized. And those wounds take many, many years to heal. So what you see right now are it's mostly the sort of mature adults who were used to agricultural life, who have been able and are still healthy, who are able to move back. But you see a lot of the young, the old, the disabled who are unable to really make that transition home. And they've been left in the camps. But meanwhile, it's just a very difficult transition from what was an emergency humanitarian response to recovery and development. Compounding that, and really where I see a key source of the problem, is the fact that the government launched this plan called the Peace, Recovery, and Development Plan for the country, but really with a focus on northern Uganda. That was supposed to start a year ago, that was really going to energize this effort to rehabilitate war-affected areas. And we've seen very little government leadership, very little government movement on that front. And that's what the people are waiting for. I mean, if you go to the camps and you talk to people who've been through this war for so long, they will say to you they feel like they have two enemies and no friends. One enemy is the government who has failed to protect them and force them into these camps, and the other enemy is the LRA. So to answer to that, to try and make amends for that, you both need to end the LRA threat so they can finally feel secure, but they also need assurances from the government that they're going to look after their needs and their concerns and help rebuild their communities.
And not too far down the road, there are scheduled elections in Uganda. Is that correct? 2011. 2011, and oftentimes in these sort of post-conflict situations, elections are opportunities for violence, where people. It's a good opportunity to rabble rouse and to get a lot of young, less uneducated men with guns on your side in order to advance your political aims. Whether and not necessarily only use the ballot, but also the bullet to achieve those. Are you seeing any signs that the election might portend a return to violence?
I think there's a likelihood. I mean, President Museveni is ostensibly running for a fourth term, well, they call it a third term. And it looks like he doesn't want to let go of the reins of power. And it's also not clear that there are any real strong alternatives that people are willing to support or believe could really do the job. But naturally, there's a real dissatisfaction and frustration with the fact that he may be staying in power for yet another term. Now, the violence that I think there is you already see increased censorship in the media, much more sensitivity around political opposition issues. But that's a different kind of frustration and friction and violence. It does harken back to the fact that the North still feels politically and socially and economically on the periphery of the country and that their needs aren't being served. And tribal and sort of divisional issues are often brought to the fore during elections. but I don't think it's increased incentive for issues with the LRA to flare up even more. But I do think you'll see tensions across the country.
Mm-hmm. Now, I guess sort of for viewers out there, are there any sort of things to look out for, any sort of markers or metrics that might sort of signify whether or not progress is being made against the LRA?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. I mean, as I said before, I think the key to this puzzle is getting those leaders. So as much as you hear news reports about, oh, okay, these 10 guys were killed or those 20 were forced to surrender, and that's good. And I think, those piecemeal efforts do help to erode the core capabilities of the LRA, but ultimately this fight will not end until those leaders have really been brought in and forced to face the music a little bit. So I think, despite all the I don't want to call it propaganda, but, the government interests in making it sound like the operation has been successful and achieved its aims, it's important to look at, well, has this threat really been ended, or has it just been displaced and moved to an area where the international community just isn't watching?
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll certainly look out for that. Thank you so much, Julia. As always, this was really informative, and you're definitely one of my favorite guests and my most frequent. So thank you so much for sharing this with us. And you return. So we're recording this on Wednesday, the 7th of January, and you said you're returning to Uganda in the next few weeks. So stay safe and keep us informed, and definitely keep in touch so we can follow this issue. This is I think it's fascinating. Certainly underreported here in the United States, but it's it's to me a true sort of human rights issue, and is one that I think deserves more attention than it gets. So thank you for being there on the ground and keeping us informed.
Well, I agree, and although I'm a little biased, but thank you very much, and it's
all right.
Always a pleasure. Thanks much.